Western philosophy is founded under duress, in a sense.
All of these other physical pleasures, like sex and eating and dancing, do not compare to the delight of having a conversation.
I think philosophy is a combat sport.
I think it's a defensive art.
The fine art of carving out free space for yourself.
There is a kind of inner strength that people have through faith, through a commitment to their own thought and heart and belief that goes beyond any of these sort of material questions. You can do philosophy anywhere, and it's very obvious that in the different dialogues, they take place all over the place.
Philosophy has to also have this location. It can't just be taking place at bus stations with schizophrenics, to be honest. Like, it has to be taking place also at the highest levels of society.
Most people are not capable of doing it at any meaningful level for very long at all.
The only thing that limits dialogue is the fact of our own death. If you're not afraid to die, you actually do have all the time in the world.
God comes down to earth and is willing to pay the ultimate price for speaking freely.
Is there a God? What is love? How should I live? Right, what is justice? These are questions that occur to everybody at a certain point. Then we are talking about slavery, which perhaps we should talk about.
Plato recognizes that it is possible that you can have highly sensitive slaves, even slaves with the souls of philosophers.
Madness is integral to philosophy, and the tension in Plato is between this training, this order, this discipline, and a certain madness.
Christianity unlocks something very special where this madness for the truth, this mad calling that a small number of people are beset by, can pursue that calling with complete radicalism.
It very clearly says that basically no one wants being a philosopher king in the philosophical city.
I'm a Socrates truther. I don't think that Socrates dies. I think his friends help him fake his death and he escapes.
Philosophy is very dangerous in this respect.
The fundamental philosophical virtue, which also everybody can share as a citizen, is courage.
All right, D.C. Miller. Jan Patočka was a Czech philosopher who studied under Heidegger and Husserl. He worked in Czechoslovakia when it was a socialist republic, but he never joined the Communist Party. What did you learn from Jan Patočka?
Well, I just wanted to tell this story because it's well known in the Czech Republic. Jan Patočka opposed the Gleichschaltung, you could call it, by means of which the Communist Party came to power in Czechoslovakia after the war. He was quite vocal in his oppositions, to the point where he was in fact sent into exile at a certain moment and banned from teaching. So he was there for a while, and eventually he was allowed to come back to Prague to give a lecture. And everybody thought that he was going to deliver some kind of a political speech, but actually instead he immediately started talking about Husserl. And I heard this story in Prague from a Czech, and he said it with a certain admiration, and I can see what he meant by that. And so I think this is a great way to introduce our discussion this morning of Plato.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. And you're right. It's a perfect way to tee off a discussion of Plato's Republic, because Plato's Republic, though it's known for many of its discussions on justice and other big topics, it has a very interesting and strange and subtle kind of pretext. It opens with a very strange scene where Socrates and Glaucon are walking back from the Piraeus to Athens, and they're suddenly interrupted by a slave boy of Polemarchus, if I recall correctly. And they go over to Polemarchus and his kind of entourage. He's got multiple people with him, which the text, makes explicit for good reason. And basically, Polemarchus demands a dialogue. Socrates and Glaucon say, basically, what if we don't want to? What if we'd rather not? We could just persuade you to let us go. And Polemarchus says, no. He says, you could try to persuade us, but if you tried to persuade us to let you go, I just wouldn't listen, Polemarchus says. And he specifically says, he uses a very strange phrase, which is translated into English as, you better make up your mind to that, is what Polemarchus says to Socrates and Glaucon. And so it's basically it's a threat of force, basically. He's got a larger number of people, which the text refers to. And he basically says, you must engage in a free philosophical dialogue with me right now. And if you don't want to, tough. And you could try to convince us otherwise. You could try to run away from us, but you're stuck. You have to have this, free expression of intellectual pursuit with us right now, whether you want to or not. And Socrates and Glaucon kind of just raise their hands and they're like, shrug. Okay, I guess let's do this. And so this people don't know the story very well. It's not very well known in the understanding or perception of Plato's Republic. But basically, Western philosophy is kind of founded under duress in a sense. What do we make of this? What does that mean? What is Plato trying to tell us here? Why don't we start with you, DC?
Well, I mean, this is an element in Plato's dialogues, which is always emphasized very heavily, for example, by Leo Strauss and by his followers, that there's dialogical argument which is happening, but there's also a mise en scène, which is putting everything into its proper context. And as you say, Socrates and Glaucon, they're returning from Piraeus, which is the local port of Athens. They're accosted by a slave boy who has been ordered by his master Polemachus. And Polemachus, I mean, maybe it's worth noting, even the etymology of his name suggests some kind of order of combat. The slave boy orders Socrates to wait. He's been ordered to order Socrates to wait. So implicitly, one could wonder, whether, in a sense, Socrates is himself in somehow a position akin to that of a slave boy. And I mean, I think that it is ironic also. I mean, Polemachus is somehow a friend of Socrates, and they're somehow jesting about whether, this is an act of duress or not. But I mean, in the broader context, of course, this is precisely the issue. What is the position of philosophy under conditions of political repression? Of course, the story of Socrates himself is precisely emblematic of this set of affairs, really, because he's attempting to philosophize in Athens. Ultimately, that modus operandi draws his own conclusion. In any case, we have, in the meantime, the Republic. Socrates goes to the house of Polemachus. He begins a dialogue with his father, Cephalus, which means the head of the household. He's an old man. He engages Cephalus in the question of justice, and this becomes then the theme of the dialogue. What is the situation of justice in a situation of political repression, potentially, but certainly political force?
Nina, is there a relationship between justice and truth? Many people would sort of assume this is that this is the case, right? That speaking the truth would tend to bring justice into the world, and similarly, to establish justice would seem to bring people into a more truthful state. But I think you think about this question differently.
Well, before we get into the hard stuff, Justin, I think we should go in gently. That we're also talking about persuasion and the art of rhetoric, are we not? How do you convince someone that they want to have a conversation with you? It's quite difficult if people don't want to talk to you. And if they don't like talking in general, because they'd rather just see their enemies defeated. And I would just like to say, first of all, thank you for having us back. It's been a while. It's very nice to speak to you two again. You're my dear philosophical friends, and I missed you. I miss you when you're not here. And to think about this guy, right? There's this brilliant line from Cephalus, right? The old dude who is basically sitting there saying, like, we have to have a conversation. But why do we have to have a conversation? Partly, it's because he says that, like, as he gets older, he realizes that all of these other physical pleasures, like sex and eating and whatever, dancing and so on, right, do not compare to the delight of having a conversation, right? This is really, really important, I think. So then the point would be something like, what's the relationship between the kind of persuasion, right, and the art of potentially diplomacy, right? So the art of dialogue as opposed to physical force, right, which again is like a founding question for every civilization, right? How do we transition from a state of war and the kind of fundamental violence that constitutes not just the founding of every state, but the ongoing reality, right? So the dialogue is the thing, if you like, where people get to express their disagreements, right? But you can't disagree with someone if they won't talk to you, if they've already decided that you're the enemy, if they've already said, we don't speak to you, we're going to censor you, we're going to shun you, then no one will speak to you. But in principle, as you know, I believe we should speak to everybody. And I think this is the philosophical position par excellence.
Right. And that philosophical position generally is hated by most people in most times and places. And I think this is something that people need to understand better, because it's like today in Western, liberal democracies, everyone likes to imagine we all like free discussion. We all like conversation. We all like, exploring each other's ideas. But in general, this is one of the most repugnant things to most people in all times and places. And I think that's what's one of the things that Plato's Republic is sort of helping us to think about. It's like, yeah, people want to have free conversations because it's fun and edifying, but they want to do it under highly legislated boundaries, right? And they want to force you into certain boundaries. And then within those politically forced boundaries, then they want to say to you, okay, now think freely, please, and entertain me, right? Isn't that kind of the hypocrisy that Plato is very subtly kind of asking, people to kind of reflect on in the way that this dialogue is set up?
Well, to pick up a little bit on the position of Cephalus, I think it's worth noting that Socrates has a brief discussion with him, but he actually doesn't participate in the dialogue. He says, okay, well, I'll leave it to my son, Polemarchus, who's the inheritor of all of my things, and then he goes off to make sacrifices. In a way, it's not even necessary for Cephalus to participate, because actually somehow implicit already in what he's saying is he understands what justice is, in fact, and he says it quite clearly right at the beginning of the dialogue. He articulates defense of justice on the basis of the soundness of mind that he has in his old age. He says that, the man who finds many unjust deeds in his life often even wakes from sleep in terror, as children do, and he lives in anticipation of evil. But Cephalus, whose mind is at ease, is therefore able to actually enjoy his station in life, because he's not tormented by memories of his own acts of injustice. And actually, this connection between the mind and the soundness of mind and the power of justice is then implicit in the whole rest of the dialogue, and not even just the dialogue, but subsequently, even when you get St. Augustine laying the kind of philosophical foundations of Christianity, this is also how he defends justice. In fact, he defends it as precisely this kind of soundness of mind. So in discussing justice in the Republic, also Socrates is discussing the possibility of the soundness of mind of the philosopher and how to attain that kind of state of being.
Especially under duress, right? When you have these political forces that are kind of telling you where to stand, telling you where to speak, threatening you if you don't, kind of engage in the dialogue that they want. Is on some level, is philosophy as a practice essentially kind of the fine art of carving out free space for yourself in a context where political forces are demanding otherwise, or something like that?
I think that's absolutely right. I think philosophy is a combat sport.
I don't disagree, but I think it's a defensive art.
Say more.
I mean, of course, self-defense can be... I gave a talk about this actually years ago after conversations with Daniel at a talk that people tried to cancel, of course, many times. But yes, philosophy as a form of self-defense. I think justice is not justice as we understand it, and certainly not as like social justice is understood by the people who are madly trying to enact it. But really, we should understand justice as balance, and this would go to the state of soundness of mind. Absolutely. The interesting question about Cephalus is soundness of mind, which we should come back to, is whether you need to have enough money to be calm or not. I would say no. I think that Socrates and Diogenes show that you can have courage and think philosophically if you trust and believe in the kindness of others, right? So that the fact that you will always have enough to eat because other people will feed you and so on. Or you live on the scraps of the city like Diogenes. So I don't think you need to be a rich man to have this soundness of mind. But I do agree that I think this kind of question of balance, if you think about all of the great religious thinkers, for example, in Auschwitz and other places where people have been, really in incredibly dire situations, and they've drawn upon their faith in order to resist on every level, like people who've been chained to radiators, people who've been kept in prison cells, right? There is a kind of inner strength that people have through faith, through a commitment to their own thought and heart and belief, that goes beyond any of these sort of material questions.
Hey everybody, real quick, I finally finished writing my latest book, The Independent Scholar, and it's the best thing I've written, the most important thing I've written, because it compiles everything I've learned over the past 5 years, figuring out this new lifestyle/business model of mine, working full-time as an independent scholar outside of institutions and on the internet. Since I left academia 5 years ago, I've been experimenting like crazy, testing all different kinds of things. I've done books and courses and subscriptions, and I've tried it all. I've tested every model and I've learned so much. I've made so many mistakes, but I've also done things well, and I've earned a few $100,000 doing all these different things. Now I've really got the model down, the ideal model. I've narrowed it down to what works the best and what's most reproducible for most people. It's just a super practical, focused book, what works and what doesn't work in the most concise and practical format possible. So buy it, order it now online at otherlife.co/scholar. You can also just search for The Independent Scholar book. Maybe add Justin Murphy in there if you want to find it more easily. otherlife.co/scholar. Go buy it, The Independent Scholar, the ideal model. Everything I've learned over the past 5 years working full-time as an independent scholar. Thank you. I'm very proud of it. otherlife.co/scholar.
Just to pick up on what Nina was saying, the theme does come up later in the Republic, because Socrates says that it's possible that too much wealth can be bad for the exercise of whatever skill is being exercised. His example is the shoemaker. Too much wealth or too little, because if he doesn't have enough money, then he's not even able to supply himself with the tools that he requires. And if he has too much money, then he's not really so interested in making shoes anymore. And he extends the same point to skill in general. He wants somehow, a relatively moderate mean of income, essentially, is what he thinks is optimum. Although, when he then subsequently starts to talk about the guardians, actually, he imagines a situation of fundamental material poverty. They exist in a position in which, in fact, they're completely identified with their public function, and they have no private wealth whatsoever. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves there.
I think that the question of wealth is an interesting one. I think you both make great points, which I agree with. Though there's also a tension, because in the fact that the dialogue in Plato's Republic sort of kicks off in the context of Cephalus's home, right? We're basically in the home of a wealthy man, I believe, and it's sort of within that context that, and in fact, this happens actually in a few of the other dialogues as well, where they make a point. I think that these dialogues are often sort of encased in wealthy contexts. And I think Plato is trying to tell us something about how the philosopher should basically think about and interact with people with money. Like wealthy men, and as Nina pointed out, like wealthy men who have built a fortune and they're aging. For that type of person, there's nothing finer in life than genuine truth-seeking with a philosopher. This is sort of like one of the greatest luxury goods out there in a way, and it's very hard to find, and it's very hard to do. And so is Plato kind of teaching us that, if you want to be a philosopher, you should, there might be a unique role to be played by kind of the nice houses of wealthy men for the production of that dialogue and the production of that philosophy? What is he trying to tell us, do you think?
Well, I think it's useful that we have the example of Thrasymachus, who's really the most dramatic person in the dialogue, and to some extent kicks the whole dialogue off. Thrasymachus, of course, is a sophist, and so his mode of being is precisely to vend his knowledge directly in exchange for money, and he's counterposed to the philosophical attitude. There's a whole other level of rhetorical complexity which comes into play, I think, with respect to what Socrates ultimately does in this dialogue, especially when he starts conceptualizing the city of the philosophers in the way in which that comes into being, actually, because he does it in order to attempt to model the question of justice. In other words, it's not somehow just his own visionary idea of a city. The city in the Republic is the just man writ large. That's how he introduces it, and that's somehow its purpose in the dialogue, to attempt to identify the position of justice within the larger canvas of the city, because it's somehow quite difficult to do it on an individual basis. So what you see when Thrasymachus enters the dialogue, first of all, he enters it in a somehow wild fashion. Plato describes him as sort of springing upon Socrates like a wild beast. And then the position that he articulates is that justice is the interest of the stronger. Socrates is concerned to say that that's actually not the case. And that effort takes the rest of the Republic really to instantiate.
Let's follow up on that, but I think Nina had a response to my question before, and then we'll return to Thrasymachus.
It was just in relation to your question about whether we need to have dialogues in wealthy people's houses and do philosophy anywhere. And it's very obvious that in the different dialogues, they take place all over the place, including outside the city in Phaedrus, where the question of rhetoric, seduction, poetry, and so on is discussed. And there's a time and a place, let's put it that way. There might be for different types of conversation, right? The symposium, we know, is the drinking party where they discuss love, and so on and so forth. So I think the attention to detail, like the topoi or whatever you want to say, is absolutely crucial. Like, you discuss justice on the steps of the courtroom, you discuss love in the drinking party, you discuss seduction outside the city walls at night when you can hear the cicadas. Like, this is very, very precise, very, very beautiful way of making this point, I think. And I think this point about speaking to everybody everywhere, right? The only thing that limits dialogue is the fact of our own death, if you see what I mean. The fact that we have limited time, right? Or we're separated from somebody else. Of course, the face-to-face dialogue is the preferable one, right? Like, this is this whole question of being present. You know, this idea that Derrida takes up, this thing about presence. You know, because the shift from the oral to the writing tradition is the shift from the being together, the being present, to the written word, which can be disseminated at distance. You can hear voices. It introduces this kind of cultural schizophrenia into the Greeks, which they deal with tragedy. It's a tragic world where you don't have tragedy to cope with the technology. But yeah, I think if you're not afraid to die, then you actually do have all the time in the world, if you see what I mean, because you're not worried about it, right? So, like, I had a conversation with a woman at the bus stop the other day for an hour about the fact that she was going to get the bus to Bristol to feed the pigeons by the bus station, and that was why she was traveling to Bristol. And then she was telling me about how McDonald's basically put kidnapped children in their hamburgers and so on. And we were having this whole conversation about meat production and the elites and pigeons, and it was wonderful, if you see what I mean. And she was so happy to have this conversation and to be listened to and so on. So in principle, we can talk about anything with everyone, but if we can be more poetic and have the right conversation in the right place, then it's even more beautiful.
I love all of that and agree with all of it completely. It's a very Christian idea to say it all, leave it all out there, and if that means they kill you, so be it. That I completely agree that is kind of the highest way to think and the highest way to live, and I think you're all completely right about that. How do you think,
I don't agree, by the way. I don't agree with this. I don't think this is exactly. I don't think this is Plato's position. I think that also.
I don't think it's Plato's position, but go on.
No, well, I mean, Plato says, of course, he hangs at the entrance of the academy the sign that says, "Let no one who is not a geometer enter here." I mean, essentially, the possibility of engaging in philosophical dialogue is not universally distributed. It's not even just a question of capacity. It's also a question of desire, the desire of one's interlocutor to engage in dialogue, their desire and their ability. These things, of course, are connected to some extent. But I think it's interesting also to consider, again, Thrasymachus's position here. I mean, Socrates obviously does engage in dialogue with him. Thrasymachus is very reluctant to engage in dialogue with Socrates. He's quite petulant, actually. He sort of he goes along with Socrates, also himself under duress, actually, kind of protesting all the time. And, in the end, the dialogue is not really a dialogue between, let's say, equal partners, because the way in which Thrasymachus conducts it is somehow directed not exactly towards, let's say, the good itself. To some extent it is, because Socrates sort of forces him onto that path. But basically Thrasymachus kind of wants to be right about what he's saying, and I think that you have this phenomenon quite generally distributed, and I think one can get a little bit led astray by sort of somehow identifying too strongly with this kind of universalism of philosophy in the context of, let's say, a kind of universal democracy. I think the point is that philosophy does have this universalist position within society. The reason why philosophical dialogues also have to happen in the houses of people like Cephalus is not for the sake of the philosopher. It's actually for the sake of the city. It's for the sake of the city that philosophy has to also have this location. It can't just be taking place at bus stations with schizophrenics, to be honest. Like, it has to be taking place, also at the highest levels of society, so that the people who are running society are able to make good decisions because they have sound mind, and they are then able to make judgments on that basis. And of course, this is also the basis, we can say, of a certain kind of Platonic critique of whatever society we have now.
Okay, I admit that my democratic, universal, Christian, St. Francis of Assisi, let's talk to the birds position is not Plato's position. I'm not claiming it is. But I do think there is actually a relationship between the schizophrenia of the woman at the bus stop and the madness of leaders, right? And actually, I do think that the dialogue is on a continuum, right? And that if everybody was... I don't know how to put it, right? Okay, of course, there are only going to be a certain numbers of guardians. Of course, it takes 40 years to train. You have to know mathematics, gymnastics, music. You have to appreciate internally the order of the universe. You have to have these limit experiences of body and mind, which render you capable of understanding the order and harmony and balance of the universe, right? Of course, we know this. It's not for everybody. Not everybody is going to be physically and mentally and spiritually strong enough to do this. Right. But I think that everybody can participate to some degree in these capacities. And I think that the fundamental philosophical virtue, which also everybody can share as a citizen, is courage. Right. And this is the courage to stand up to bullies, whether it's someone who's bullying you at work, the courage to stand up to bad ideas. We're now overrun by bad ideas because, really, really insane people have been allowed to make claims and threaten people with these crazy ideas, and this is a pathocracy. This is what is being discussed in the Ponerology book by Lobachevsky. And so I think there is a kind of continuum of philosophy in which everybody can participate to some degree.
Well, again, I must dispute that. I think that, at least from the point of view of what Plato is saying in the Republic, I mean, when he articulates the different classes of personages who will inhabit the city, he does it quite strictly based on an understanding that indeed capacities are not universally or even evenly distributed. The participation of people, for example, like shoemakers in Plato's city in philosophy, is not because they're directly participating in philosophy. It's because the city is well run. In other words, because the city is just, everyone participates in justice. But that doesn't actually mean that everybody is participating in philosophical discussions. And in fact, Socrates is quite clear on this point, or at least Plato's Socrates, because Socrates himself, I think, maybe was not so clear on it, and that, of course, had its own consequences. But he says that, in fact, people should remain within their classes, as it were. In other words, the guardian should do guardian stuff, the shoemakers should do shoemaker stuff, the moneymakers should do money-making stuff. And people shouldn't get confused about these things, because actually when that happens, that's when you start to get the production of injustice, because the city is no longer being properly organized. So I would say attempting to sort of universally mobilize a kind of philosophical mass is, I mean, this is ultimately, somehow I would say Marxist proposition, but this is not the classical Greek proposition. The classical Greek proposition is we properly train the philosophers through, Socrates says in this case, gymnastics and music, basically, so that they have the correct spirit, so that they're able to administer justice in the city, and then everyone benefits from justice. That's the role of philosophy, not simply spreading philosophy, ideologically through the body of society.
Okay, even if we accept the kind of gold, silver, bronze souls, the kind of caste hierarchy, the training and the differential capacity, I mean, which is objectively true, like difference is what there is, right? Like we're all different, we're different ages apart from anything else, we all have different whatever skills and capabilities. But I think that the fundamental desire to talk and to ask questions, for example, will happen to everybody. Is there a God? What is love? How should I live? Right? These are moral questions. These are questions that are existential. They're philosophical. Okay, we might say that certain religions have an answer. Okay, and then we're talking about the relationship between an exoteric set of rules and an esoteric set of rules, right? So we might say, look, for different castes, for different classes, there may need to be different rules, right? There might need to be different norms. There might need to be different morals, right? If you say to everybody, as liberalism does, follow your desire, right? You can do and be whatever you want. I mean, this is fundamentally chaotic, right? This is an incredibly bad imperative. It's extremely destructive. We can see our cities are overrun by drug abuse and so on. I mean, not to mention the sexual impulses run wild. So look, the relationship, I think, between the order of a society and its human composition, right? Of course, this is what Plato is talking about. But I think a kind of rounded, ordered, beautiful life will also have time and respect for the shoemaker's question. How should I live? How best should I live? What is love? What is justice? Right? These are questions that occur to everybody at a certain point in response to life events, encounters, and so on. And I can't say that that's not philosophy. That is philosophy to me. And I do think that Socrates, precisely by corrupting the youth, remember, Socrates is accused of fundamentally misleading young men, right? So there is a class, whatever class Socrates is from, we can talk about Socrates' class, spiritually speaking or materially speaking. There is always a question of this cross-class, how can we put it? Interaction, right? Or contamination, even. The rich man who picks up his shoes at the shoemaker's shop, the poorer guy, the worker says to the rich man, how do you feel about your life, or what makes you happy, right? Is that a philosophical interaction?
Well, I think that you making a big assumption when you say that the shoemaker is concerned with the question of justice. I think the way that he approaches that question actually is a little bit different than the way a philosopher approaches this question. I think the question of justice for the shoemaker is, how do I make good shoes, basically? And that's, by the way, like a perfectly honorable way of approaching this question. I don't think necessarily, although of course, ironically, we do have many examples of very metaphysical shoemakers in history, but I don't think the shoemaker is necessarily interested in or wants to be or let's say even should be compelled to become an existentialist philosopher. I think actually it's better if they're focusing their capacity for the good on their own métier. And I think this is the position that you're articulating is most anti-Platonic, actually, in its implications.
But
if I may say
Daniel,
so.
man is not a machine, right? Man is not a machine, right? Even if you reduce a person to their function, right? You are a masseuse, you are a shoemaker, you are a teacher, whatever, right? Like that does not exceed the bounds of somebody's capacity or their humanity, right? Or it doesn't encapsulate it, if you see what I mean, right? Late at night, like the person who's stacking shelves, who's putting things in baskets to be delivered by some person on £4.50 an hour who rides a bike around the city, right? Are these people, like, when they're having thoughts about their lives? I'm not saying that people must be compelled to philosophize, by the way, right? It's not a kind of imperative in that sense. I'm saying that it's a natural feature of existence and being alive, because man is not a machine. The moment we reduce man to a machine, then we are talking about slavery, which perhaps we should talk about.
But this is not. This is again not Plato's perspective. I mean, he talks specifically about techne. So ultimately the philosophical techne is one techne, the shoemaking techne is another techne. Excellence in one's techne is entirely dignified. It's not about being a machine. It's about actually applying your capacities to your craft in order to produce excellent shoes, which is a very fulfilling thing to do. You're saying that for some reason there's philosophical techne which everybody has, which I think is A, not true, B, not true, and C, also not true. I think it's actually delusional to say this, and very dangerous, because it then actually leads you to the point where you have, people who don't really have the craft of philosophizing, engaging in forms of philosophy. And what they produce is actually not philosophy. They produce things that are sort of almost like it's monstrous caricatures, really. And I think this is also what we have as a consequence of a certain kind of, ill-founded democratic universalism with respect to these kinds of abstractions that actually, should probably remain in the academy as opposed to sort of wandering through the world like hell.
Well, so look, there's a synthesis here. I think you're both right, and it's reflected in the fact that this Greek concept of parousia, that their sense of radical free speech as they understood it, this word parousia was used both in a positive sense and in a negative sense. There were just basically two meanings of this word. It could be a noble activity that thoughtful philosophers engage in at great risk to their own life when they speak freely in public and they say things that are dangerous and that are generally prohibited, that they could lose their life for saying. That's a noble kind of parousia, which was well understood as noble. But parousia was also the word that was used to describe the meaningless democratic chatter of a confused and degenerate city. So the same exact word was used to describe both noble, courageous, virtuous free speech and also meaningless, wasteful nonsense spoken by kind of deluded schizophrenics in the public square, right? So you're both right. And I think the synthesis here really is that basically it's like philosophy is this universalist calling. It is in fact something that everyone can relate to in some degree somehow. Like at some point in everyone's life, they've sort of had an encounter with sort of the radical possibility of human thought and of thinking and speaking fully. But most people are not cut out for it. Most people are not capable of doing it at any meaningful level for very long at all. And most importantly, Nina, most people hate it when they encounter it. It is simply the case that you start talking to the shoemaker about, the philosophies of justice, and in general, they'll be annoyed. But then sooner or later, they will actually want to kill you if you go on long enough and you kind of fully explain what all this stuff involves. This is certainly encoded in the Socratic texts, and I think we see it today, right? We see it amply today. Like people talk about free speech, people say they want a kind of robust, interesting public culture, and everywhere you look, if you actually are saying anything that's prohibited, people will file lawsuits and so on, right? So I think the real synthesis comes with Christianity, frankly. Like even Christ himself, who's willing to pay the ultimate, God comes down to earth and is willing to pay the ultimate price for speaking freely. Even Christ, you read the Gospels carefully, he's also dodging bullets, like sometimes, the mob comes for him and he's like, all right, I'm out of here for now. He says, my hour has not come yet. I'm not going to let these people hang me right now. He's not afraid of being hung. He's not afraid of being killed, which he knows that he will be killed. But that doesn't mean that he needs to go and be killed at all times. And that he needs to sort of naively submit to the lynching of the mob at all times in all places. So even Christ himself engages in a kind of political logic of some kind where, he may occasionally sort of hide from power in a sense. So that to me is the synthesis. The synthesis is, the philosopher is called to speak the truth fully and freely, and the philosopher aims to do so to his or her greatest ability, but also while trying to navigate different social subspaces and social contexts gracefully in a way that is pleasing and beautiful and where you're not rushing into your death naively, unnecessarily, but you're ready for death when it comes, and it surely will.
Okay, two things. What first of all is the Meno dialogue where the slave boy, another slave boy, is maybe it's the same one, who knows, is shown to have the capacity to practice geometry, right, as a fundamental capacity, regardless of his social status. The second thing I want to say is a question to both of you, which is that do you think that anybody or everybody has the capacity to recognize beauty?
I think everyone has the capacity to recognize it to some degree, just like they have the capacity to kind of feel the truth and know there's the truth. Like everyone, I do agree with the universalist concept that everyone on some level has basic functions and capacities to be sensitive to these things and to know these things. But the ability to actually pursue it, the ability to hold it and to cultivate it, these ability and or to even understand it or appreciate it, let alone have the courage to bet on it and to develop it. Those capacities are seriously unequally distributed to an extreme degree, I would say. But I think that basic function, that basic sensitivity, is kind of universal. Was my view.
I mean, first of all, with respect to Meno's slave boy, it's not a question of social status. This is not the point. Plato recognizes that it is possible that you can have, highly sensitive slaves, even, slaves with the souls of philosophers. I mean, when he articulates the model of the Republic of Philosophy, he allows for this possibility. In fact, it's, right there at the center of it, really, the fact that the talents, let's say, they're not distributed in alignment with social classes. They can be found wherever. So it's not about social class. This is I would say, Marxist misreading of the spiritual conception which Plato is articulating. Second point is, obviously, right at the heart of the Republic, we have the allegory of the cave. So this is, what happens when you try to philosophize to people who really actually don't want you to go anywhere near them. They prefer just to watch, the shadows moving across the wall, like a swastika flies by, and they get really excited about that for a while, and so on and so forth. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to ask themselves how, the situation has been set up. That's not what they're interested in doing, unfortunately. So from that point of view, one can say, well, everybody has somehow like an inbuilt capacity for beauty. Maybe they do, but I mean, this is also not necessarily sufficient, actually, to be meaningful within the broader political context, because ultimately what you need to be able to do is understand not just that some things are beautiful. For example, a woman is beautiful, or a Lamborghini is beautiful, or whatever it is, but to be able to talk about the form of beauty itself, right? To be able to understand, to even know of the existence of the forms. So this is the element which distinguishes the soul of the philosopher, really. They understand the existence of the forms. And actually, it's also possible maybe to forget about the existence of the forms, which is why you have to do all of this training in order to make sure that they're, on the one hand, sufficiently sensitive to be able to perceive them, which is why you need all of this musical training. And on the other hand, sufficiently tough-minded so as to not get distracted by your own, roving desires. Of course, this would never happen to me. Like, and this is why you have the gymnastics training, and you're training the philosopher, and you're actually engaging in this very systematic process of training to maintain people in this position where they're able to exercise this judgment, which is not easy to do, actually. It's not just a pre-given. It requires enormous efforts of society. And I think that actually, once one starts to say that, actually we all could do it, it's always there, it's always, present. Like we really misunderstand the let's say metaphysics of what these kinds of problems entail.
I think that's absolutely right, but I think Nina's also right that there is this sort of universalist kind of obligation and injunction that philosophy calls us to speak the truth wildly and publicly, and to the people at the bus stop, and and to treat other people as if they are capable of understanding beauty and understanding the forms and understanding truth, and to talk to every person as if they too have some ability to transcend, their own current limitations, to speak the truth more boldly, to pursue beauty more fully. So there is a kind of naivety to that universalism, but it is a kind of beautiful and correct naivety that, frankly, I do think that the single greatest synthesis of all this stuff, it does just come in the form of Christianity, because Christianity understands its own sort of doomed nature. Christianity knows that most people are not going to want to accept the truth. It sort of prices all of that in and expects that, but also the Christian understands that the universal truths are universal, and everyone is equally sort of required to try their best, and everyone will be judged according to the same canons, and so it's like most people can't do it, and yet we all must, and that's, I think, a very honest and sophisticated kind of reckoning with it.
Well, I think with
Okay,
respect
let
to
me.
Christianity, sorry, may I make a brief intervention on this point, and then you can continue your
Sure.
apologia. I mean, I think that you can see in Christianity that there's, I can't remember whose phrase it was, but exoteric Platonism. In fact, you have at different levels of the Christian doctrine, you have something for the shoemakers. You also have something for Thomas Aquinas. Basically, the recognition is that it's not necessary for the medieval peasant to engage in complex, abstruse philosophical disquisitions, for example, on the metaphysical intricacies of the Trinity. Actually, all they really need to do is say, look, there's a really great image here of the Virgin and the Child. That's what it's kind of about. That's all you have to do. Just do that. That's fine. I would say the innovation in that respect is that it recognizes the place of philosophy, and it doesn't attempt to expand it through the rest of society. It doesn't try to socialize Christianity in this way, which I think is probably something that's quite valuable about it. It has this ability to scale, vertically. I think you see in almost every religion actually a sort of effort to sort of put philosophy into a certain place where it's not going to cause any harm. You see this also in Islam. The sort of the Sufi, or like the mystical elements of Islam, are not the same forms of Islam that are actually taught in society. They are confined to the haram, to the sheltered units of royal society, and that's where they are. So philosophy is very dangerous in this respect, and we should also recognize its danger, because they say, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Please continue, Nina. You wish to say more about Christianity?
Well, several things. If we accept that on some level, well, actually, on every level, that everybody is in possession of a soul. Whether the soul is sexed is a very interesting question, which we probably don't have time to go into in this dialogue, but maybe in a future one we could ask whether the soul is male or female. But let's just say everybody has a soul. Of course, Plato wants to say that there are gold, silver, and bronze souls, and so on and so forth. Fine. Okay. But for everybody to appreciate the order, right? So for the guardians, even if we say like there is a kind of a hierarchy, that some people are up here, some people, their techne is this. Okay, that's a society. If everybody understands their place in society, and that doesn't mean accepting, let's say, a kind of hierarchy that is negative, but rather something like people are valued for everything they do, whether it's raising children, making shoes, I don't know, picking up the rubbish from the streets. If we have a society which is dignified in its recognition of the value of every soul, right? In whatever respect the soul is articulating itself, however the techne is being performed, this is a far superior society, precisely because there is a recognition of the beauty of harmony and order. And so, for example, let's say the peasant finding his wife beautiful. Okay, we know that beauty is a process of the recognition of the forms. It's the access to the forms. People get confused. They think that their dick is access to the form, right? They think, the beauty of the boy or the beauty of the woman is beauty, right? This is an error, right? We know that Plato thinks this is an error. Like, beauty is access to the forms, right? What do the forms allow? They allow remembering. They allow us to remember who we are, right? Everybody is capable of remembering to some degree. I agree that the philosopher escaping the cave, looking at the sun, goes mad. I think madness is integral, actually, to philosophy. And the tension in Plato is between this training, this order, this discipline, and a certain madness, right? The madness of Socrates and then Diogenes, but also the madness of the philosopher, him or herself, right? Insofar as the moment you breach certain limits, restrictions on what you're allowed to say, right? Like we live in a world that's full of restrictions about what you are and aren't allowed to say, right? If you make the wrong joke, if you say the wrong thing, of course we know the social punishments and even the legal punishments are extremely high, right? Our free liberal society is nothing of the sort, right? So that when we breach these thresholds, there is a necessity for the philosopher to be able to breach them, however he or she does it, in order to step outside of the demos, right? In order to step outside of the peculiarity of whatever regime we live in. Of course, this is not very easy, right? This is something that not many people are going to attempt because they don't want to lose their shadows, and they don't want to lose their wife or their husband or their children. They don't want to risk their thing, and nor should they. An ordered society should protect those people from tyranny, from authoritarians, from violence. A well-ordered society, in a well-ordered society, everyone would be valued, and everybody does, I believe, have a soul.
Well, Plato identifies madness in philosophy very specifically in the allegory of the cave, which is that the philosopher attempts to go back to the cave and tell all the people there that you're free, like you're and which is sort of in a sense what you're saying, is it not? And like it's actually also in a sort of way what democratic society in general is saying. They're saying that everyone can be a philosopher, should be a philosopher. Actually, not everyone should be a philosopher or can be a philosopher. Who wants to be a philosopher? The philosophically ordered polis is the one in which, precisely because philosophy is in its proper place, everything else is in its proper place too. So actually that is the society in which we don't say that philosophy is the highest techne in terms of any kind of social status as such. We actually recognize also the value of shoemaking and whatever else it is. And we don't try and make the shoemakers into philosophers. We let them be shoemakers. They're happy being shoemakers. We let the philosophers be philosophers. They're happy being philosophers. But according to Plato, I mean, this is a model which depends upon very tight and specific restrictions and trainings happening for the philosophers. It's not necessarily even, just like a wonderful thing, let's say, to have this kind of political responsibility. It might be much more pleasant to actually be a shoemaker, really. You don't have this kind of same, burden of leadership that we also saw, demonstrated by, our own philosopher king, on the weekend. Like, that is a heavy responsibility. It requires almost kind of constant self-disciplining in order to achieve that. Does anybody really want that? I think that actually Socrates even says in this dialogue, ultimately the reason why philosophers are prepared to accept this burden of leadership is not because of the rewards that it will bring them. And actually, he very clearly says there are basically no rewards, being a philosopher king in the philosophical city. The only reward that you have is that you're not having somebody else doing it worse. That's the only real reason for doing it.
If I may, let me say one final thing on this, and then Daniel, I want to ask you about what you've been learning in China studying kung fu. Mm-hmm. But I think it's instructive to compare, let's say, someone like Saint Francis to Socrates. And Nina mentioned Saint Francis before, so she made me think of it. But in the figure of Saint Francis, here you have a wealthy, a young man who's born into a wealthy family. He decides to basically abandon all of his family's wealth and status, and quite against the wishes of his parents, who were horrified by this calling that he had to wander the wilderness with nothing whatsoever, hardly even a shirt on his back. His parents were horrified by this, but he felt called by God to do this. He felt a very direct and specific calling that he must do this from God himself, he believed. And so he went and did this, quite to everyone's confusion and pretty much to no one's satisfaction at first. But very quickly, he's wandering around in the snow, like across Italy, really quite mad, right? I mean, by any definition of the word mad, here you have a madman. I mean, this is a guy who, from an external perspective at the time, clearly this guy just went off his rocker. We've never seen anything like this before. No one's ever pursued this kind of lifestyle before in this way. And so here you have a madman who feels called by the truth, essentially, to go off and do something quite to the dissatisfaction of those around him. And if you compare someone like St. Francis and his journey and adventure to someone like Socrates, they have a little bit of common, right? They're wanderers. They're kind of weird and provocative and pursuing their own path, right? St. Francis talks to the shoemakers in a way that is very different, right? And in a way, people like St. Francis get this kind of positive reputation from people of all social stations, including the lowest social stations, because in some ways he's sort of in alliance with the poor. He kind of makes this kind of gesture to kind of be on the level of the poor voluntarily, similar to someone like Diogenes, but in this much more elevated way that is able to kind of snowball into a kind of West European civilizational dynamic that the Greeks were never able to unlock. And that would be kind of, I think an interesting data point that has to be considered here, especially when we're talking about the city and what is justice in the city and what makes for a flourishing city. I'll just put it to you and to the listeners that it seems to me that Christianity unlocks something very special where this sort of this madness for the truth, this mad calling that a small number of people are beset by, can pursue that calling with complete radicalism and a complete kind of universalism, but now in a way that the Greeks were never able to unlock. Now there's something about it where it can actually manifest into these increasing ripples of kind of pro-social, pro-civilizational kind of stability and harmony and even growth and development, because it's really only in Western Europe that, kind of modern economics even really become possible. So I don't want to argue that too hard or force you all to respond to all of that. But in my sense of things, that's kind of like a really important data point for thinking about how philosophy is supposed to link up with a healthy, thriving city. Okay. Dan, what's that? And it occurs to me now that it's sort of unreasonable to make a big point and then give myself the last word. So feel free to. Daniel looks like he's biting his tongue. Please, I'll give you guys the last word on this. It's a great little conversation. So we should put a nice bow on it, and then I have a few more questions for you guys. But please feel free to respond.
Well, I would just like to say, of course, that I'm the only participant in this dialogue who is not a Christian, and although I respect Christianity, I am not of that faith. I think it's.
I didn't actually know that Nina. I didn't know Nina identifies as Christian. Maybe it's another conversation, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Christian question is obviously enormously complex, and I think that obviously we can talk about Saint Francis, very singular figure, of course, in the history of Christianity. Other examples of wandering holy men / madmen who didn't necessarily have such a happy fate in the end, of course, in the history of Christianity. I don't know. I feel like this topic is too enormous to somehow pursue at this moment. So I just suspend the question basically, and
Fair enough.
and iterate my suspension. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that, and I didn't mean to put a big new point on the table without giving you all time to discuss it and share your own points on it. But Nina, did you have a final thing on that?
I did, very briefly. I think that everybody goes mad sometimes, actually, and we have a society that basically prevents people from going mad in a beautiful way, right? We have a society that's heavily medicated on various drugs, and especially America. I mean, America's extremely medicated at this point. it prevents people from feeling grief, from feeling love. Okay, we can artificially create sexual desire through drugs. Also, there's heavy porn use and so on, right? But all of these subtleties of feeling, and all of these actually very beautiful experiences, like painful but beautiful experiences, are the things that are being neutered and eroded. And I think that everybody, yes, in a democratic sense, I think the love is a kind of madness when you fall in love with someone. And I think that to have an understanding of the democracy of madness is absolutely integral to any thinking of an ordered state, actually, right? There is a synthesis. There's no necessary opposition between a democratic philosophizing, a democratic madness, and a beautiful, harmonious, structured, ordered society.
Daniel, I would love to hear you riff on this stuff at greater length. So maybe we'll do it again, and we can have you back on to share your thoughts on all this. I didn't actually realize there were two Christians in the room. I thought I was just sort of repping my angle here. I didn't mean to gang up on you there, Daniel.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine with it. I don't feel beset upon, not at all. But I mean,
no,
of course,
but this is the fun conversation, right? Like precisely to
this
like,
is great.
To disagree.
This is fascinating. It's really good, and it's very productive. I think it's right up my audience's alley. I think people will enjoy this as well. Daniel, tell us about Kung Fu. I know that you've been studying Kung Fu in China. The Greeks obviously famously stressed the significance of physical training for the philosophical life. What have you learned about this from doing it yourself?
Well, I think that when Socrates is emphasizing the importance of gymnastics, I think in a way he could be emphasizing the importance of martial arts, because it's a very particular way of thinking, actually, and training. It's a way of thinking in and through the body, really. And obviously anything you do to the body has mental effects. I don't know exactly where to begin. I think that just in terms of literally what I did, I was in a monastery for 6 months, training, 5 to 6 hours a day, very intense physical training. Really what it involves is just sort of practicing over and over again, like very specific physical movements, kicks, punches, blocks, steps, and then also these kinds of sequences that you sort of put together. And we were also doing kickboxing training. So I hadn't really done a lot of martial arts in my life before, and I think it was interesting to sort of put myself in the mind frame of that form of thinking, because it does affect your thought in definite ways. I mean, I think that in particular when you're learning martial arts, when you're learning more, combat sports, you start to look at the world in this sort of more, polemical manner in a certain way, in terms of its possibilities for attack and defense, not just literally, but in general, also from the point of view of the kinds of operations that are proceeding also through, rhetoric and dialogue, and how people also sort of leave themselves exposed in certain ways and how shouldn't leave oneself exposed. And I think it's very helpful, actually. I think it's extremely helpful for anybody involved in thinking to also be involved in training physically in this way, because I think it sharpens your mind, actually, in a definite way. So this is why I think actually it makes a lot of sense that Socrates is sort of continually emphasizing this, this physical element with respect to the training of philosophers in the Republic.
Well, it brings us full circle when we started talking the conversation about sort of the political framing of how the dialogue in the Republic begins as this kind of threat of force is what sort of motivates the entire thing. And Nina, said that she sees philosophy as a combat sport, but a defensive combat sport. And in the case of Socrates, that is kind of what's going on, right? Like Socrates and Glaucon, they're just going about their way, minding their own business. Like they on some level, implicitly, they just want to be left alone. They just want to go back to Athens, but they're sort of blocked by political force, and so they have to kind of do something, right? They have to go along with it, and they have to navigate it. And so in some ways, philosophy, Plato's Republic, seems to be telling us is this kind of rhetorical combat sport where we use thinking and ideas and words to navigate a political order that is typically sort of hostile to us and will not allow us to just let us be. It's a way of is philosophy a way of combating and handling a political order that just refuses to let us be?
I think there's one way you can read the Republic, which is basically how to survive as a philosopher, and the things that Plato recommends or articulates, to his reader are also ways of articulating what is necessary to think and to do in order to actually continue to live philosophically, So he warns you about potentially dangerous moves that you could make, and I think that we should be sensitive to his warnings, because obviously he is also writing following the death of Socrates. He has some understanding of the kinds of dangers which philosophizing in public can involve. There are several dangers, you could say, from the point of view of philosophy, and Plato maps them onto the city, but you could say that basically they're, external dangers and they're also internal dangers. And so, one has to be on guard against both of them. One has to maintain one's own spirit in a certain kind of position, which makes one able to continue to philosophize without falling into, what would be actually a sort of lesser mode of existence. And then one also must be able to defend oneself against force, which is ultimately indifferent to philosophy or maybe even hostile to it. And I think that we can say that even in the sort of success of the book, its survival over time, ultimately Plato's guidelines were quite good. Philosophy does survive. It continues to survive. It has continued to survive under any conditions of oppression. It has nonetheless persisted, and it will continue to persist.
I
A
agree with
related
that. I think
question.
that's okay.
Go ahead, please.
No, I was just saying that. No, I completely agree with that. Like as a training manual, it's fantastic, right? Like, if one looks after one's body through yoga, through martial arts, through walking in the sun, like you're really in a very different relation to your body than the one that this current regime wants you to be, right? If you're not on drugs, if you're not taking any of their crap, you're not eating their bad food, like you're looking after yourself, like your thoughts are elevated, like your entire being is elevated. And music, I wake up some mornings and I remember that music exists, and it's just this greatest elevation, like this most beautiful, like all of this and music too, or you can listen to the bird song if you don't have any records, if you can just listen to the sound of nature. It's already a fantastic. So I think this is like a survival manual. And also I'm a Socrates truther. I don't think that Socrates dies. I think his friends help him fake his death, and he actually escapes, and he turns up in later dialogues. And I've discussed this with Daniel before. So, but either way, whether Socrates, he doesn't really die. He never dies. He doesn't die in Plato's memory. He doesn't die for us. Socrates is the martyr of philosophy. And the fact that we can still discuss Plato in 2024 is just a testament to this profound, I don't know, beautiful truth.
Well, I think you're onto something there, and I think that intuition you have about Socrates never dying is really quite dramatized and actualized in the Christ story, of course, where that is made sort of literal and more direct and aggressive. That very idea, and obviously it's well known and it's been well documented the many ways in which Socrates is kind of a precursor to Christ. People know that one of his crimes was, of course, corrupting the youth. Someone mentioned that before in this conversation. But one of his other crimes he was charged with was the introduction of foreign deities. So there is this religious element here in all of this. And it is, it can't be ignored, I think. Okay, I have a question for you all about sort of the one popular way of reading Plato is through Strauss, of course, and the Straussians sort of popularized this idea that Plato's Republic is essentially ironic, that all of the crazy stuff in there should all be taken with a grain of salt, and the real lesson is that this is an ironic mode of philosophizing, and perhaps in fact political philosophy must be ironic in a kind of structural way, because the threats of power and force are and threats of persecution are so omnipresent and serious that that political philosophy sort of has this tight relationship with the ironic kind of attitude and posture. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I think today in Western culture, it's sort of like we're so saturated with irony that I think right now there's a kind of aversion to irony, and there's this sort of demand for greater sincerity and for more kind of direct truth telling. And I have a sense that this is sort of what I prefer and what I want more of, and I guess what I try to do in my own little way. But the contention from Socrates and Plato might just be that that's naive, and that irony is always going to be a necessary sort of combat mode of the philosopher. Do you think that's true today still, or should we be post irony?
Shall I go?
Sure, please.
I mean, I think you can't really get rid of irony because it is a element of language ultimately. So the ironic mode is going to remain. I think that efforts to, let's say, de-ironize language are also actually quite destructive because they're attempting to produce a sincerity which is not really possible even. I mean, the tradition of deconstruction, which is usually applying a very systematic rhetorical analysis to all of these texts, I think is really germane in that regard. It's a mode of language. Irony will be there.
But Daniel, do you real quick to interject? Do you agree though that sort of modern bourgeois man is sort of just drowning in irony? Like we all, the default mode now for modern man is sort of like this extremely wishy-washy, nothing is real or good or true or bad. It's all just I'll just be kind of ironic about everything, and it'll all wash out. Like has irony not kind of saturated to an extremely kind of unfortunate
I think
degree?
it's one wonders whether that really even is irony. Actually, I think there's like it's actually quite a complex question, really. I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, it's a sort of like it's actually a sort of form of cynicism, really, but not
Right.
not Diogenes.
It becomes that, I think.
It's irony no longer actually even being deployed for any sort of purpose. Actually, it's just a kind of irony detached, actually, from any sense of, let's say, the truth. I mean, you can be ironic insofar as you know what is true or not, right? We're discussing a culture which is sort of ironized also all higher values and basically says that, like, we don't really believe in them anymore because to do so would be somehow, cringe, right? It would be cringe to sort of believe in the truth. And we affect this sort of posture, this kind of this nihilistic, ironic posture. I don't think it actually is really irony, though, in its classical sense. I think it's just basically nihilism, which is sort of operating in the guise of irony. So I don't know, like post-irony, I think this is probably like a not quite precise way of theorizing really what's going on there. I think that what we have to think more about is not exactly the language in which this kind of spiritual condition is expressing itself, but the sort of the condition itself, and like what is sort of somehow speaking in this way, and like what kind of affect is involved in that kind of thought.
I think it's very instructive that the people who regard us as their enemies seek to impose single meanings on words and phrases, or indeed inverted meanings, and say that this is the only meaning, right? So I think polysemy and the interpretation and the place of irony, which indeed can only exist in relation to truth. And so I agree with Daniel that we're not talking about irony, really. We're talking about a kind of, a sort of eviscerated nihilism that presents itself as irony, but it's not irony because you can only be ironic if you also have an orientation to the truth. So, for example, like the play of seduction between men and women depends upon knowing the truth that there are men and women, for example, right? So any irony in seduction depends upon a deeper recognition of a truth, to give you one example. So, yeah, I think that we have to oppose the authoritarian lockdown on language, or the inverted authoritarian lockdown on language, because those are the people seeking to control the narrative, to control who can speak, to control the meaning of words, and when and where they can be spoken.
I think I disagree on this. I think what we need really is a rectification of names. So I think DC Miller actually said to me many years ago on our last podcast, DC implanted this phrase in my mind, and that phrase has stuck with me ever since then. Daniel, you'll be happy to hear. My view is almost the exact opposite. I feel like the problem is that people want to reserve the right to make any word mean anything at any time. And that's generally what people do. So to me, the real authoritarian kind of, tyrannical threat that we're seeing right now kind of gain power is sort of this mad nihilistic antinomialism where no word has to mean anything. And that, to really sort of redeem, yeah, just in my mental model, like redemption for truth seekers will only come through a kind of increasing sort of clarity around putting words in their proper place, not in an authoritarian way, like forcing people how to use words or something like that. But that's kind of my sense of things. I don't know, Daniel, if you have a view on this.
Well, the phrase rectification of names, of course, comes from Confucius. Confucius's argument is essentially that if we're not able to even have a grasp on language, then we can't basically do anything because nobody really knows what they're saying anymore. So I think, what you're describing, in my opinion, correctly, is a kind of anarcho-tyranny of language. It's not that, like, how to put it, like, it's not as if actually anything can mean anything. It's that it can mean anything if you sort of want it to be and you're sufficiently somehow invested in claiming that it is, And so we see this kind of collapse of, I guess you could say, order in language. And therefore, am I here? Yeah, so you see this kind of collapse in the sort of natural order of language and its degeneration essentially into sort of a series of almost, rhetorical stratagems or just sort of kinds of tricks that basically power pushes through the medium of language in order to achieve whatever it wants, really. It's like a language of power without authority, So from this point of view, you could say, well, what needs to happen then is somehow the reassertion of a certain kind of authority in language, an authority of meaning, actually, so that it isn't just a question of a totally arbitrary, and willful claim being made, irrespective of the real evidence behind it. There's something which is actually capable of objective analysis to say whether something means this or something means that. So yeah, rectification in that respect would be kind of rectification of the truth of language, as it were, and the reality of language is not simply subjective, but also sort of somehow medium which carries within it a kind of spiritual quality. And I think that irony is, like I said, it is a dimension of language. Like we need to also appreciate that there is this element of language which is humorous, which is fluid, which is not necessarily straightforward, and then respond to that also, as Nina was saying earlier, like we're not machines, we're speaking beings, and we demand the right to speak also thoughtfully and humorously using the language that we have. And I think that, like I said, it isn't irony per se, it's just a kind of inflation of irony to the point where it just becomes sort of irony poisoned, as it were. But, I think that we do want a world in which there is irony.
Yeah, I mean, can I be clear? Because I think my point is being misunderstood. So let me try to be clearer. Like, for example, it give me nothing but pleasure to have the word woman in law, for example, means very much adult female human, right? Okay, so I am all for the rectification of names, right? This is not incompatible with a kind of playfulness I think that Daniel was pointing to as well. So that, for example, if in a jokey way, in a private message with a friend, one suggests that one holds a position that one does not in fact have, that in the context, this is understood as not being a straightforward claim about the meaning of words, but rather something that is playing with context and so on. So I think But what I mean by the authoritarian lockdown on language is basically people saying, you know, I want this word, as Daniel said, it's a question of desire. I want this word or this term or this concept to mean this. Okay, maybe this meaning is radically opposed to what the entire history of humanity meant by this word up until 5 minutes ago, right? And I'm going to enforce it by power. And if people don't go along with it, I'm going to mess them up. You know, I mean, this is what I mean about this battle, the battleground of concepts. It is a battleground. You know, it is a fight, and we do have to protect ourselves and defend ourselves. And I think, but in order so that we can play with these concepts, right? So that irony has to have a relationship to truth. There can't just be irony and there can't just be truth, because truth alone is too cold. It's too much to bear. You know, in and of itself, right? Like that kind of, you know, it's hard to accept the truth. This is why people don't like science, really. They pretend they do, but they don't. They like a fake fantasy image of, you know, science that makes them feel better about themselves. They don't actually like the results of any research that goes against their sort of stupid liberal values, right? And if they really were committed to science, they'd be like, well, this information hurts me, you know. Actually, this is bad news for our liberal fantasy of ourselves or whatever, right?
It's a battleground indeed. Thank you both for joining us. Everyone should go check out Nina's Substack first and foremost. Nina's a free agent now. She is the epitome of, you know, the modern independent scholar. Go check out her Substack. It's ninapower.substack.com. Stay in touch with her and follow her work. I'm sure she will be up to interesting things moving forward. And DC Miller is the editor of I Am
Literary
1776. I'm sorry?
I'm the literary editor.
Literary editor. Okay, sorry. I don't want to be gassing you up too much, but it is, I must say, a very good publication, which I only recently, I've been watching them for a long time and kind of reading some stuff online, very, you know, with great interest and sympathetic to it, but I haven't actually settled in with it until recently. But I actually spent real time reading, especially your lead essay, Daniel, and I really quite appreciated. This issue is about futurism. Go buy it. It's great reading and it's a beautiful product. And yeah, I really appreciate what I Am 1776 is doing. It's a cool group of people and it's still very underrated, I think. So great work, Daniel, and everyone should go check that out and buy it. Both of you, thank you so much. It's been 5 years since our last recording. And by the way, many people over the years have reached out to me saying that they enjoyed our conversation. And a lot of people kind of found me through our conversation, which a lot of people kind of found quite edifying. So thank you so much for that one. And thank you so much for this one. This was an excellent conversation. And I'm really, you know, lucky to know both of you. I'm very privileged to count both of you as interlocutors of mine. And I hope we'll have many more conversations. So thank you both for doing the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Just interlocutors, but also friends.
Of course. But that's implied, right?